Andy Woods, and he is finishing his doctorate at Dallas Theological Seminary in the Bible Exposition Department. Andy's originally from California and was an attorney for a number of years before he went to seminary, got his master's, and now finishing his doctorate. And he has had a tremendous interest in eschatology over the years. He's had some articles published in various journals as well as books, and he's going to be writing his doctoral dissertation dealing with the subject that he's going to be doing today, but he's going to focus his dissertation on Revelation 17 and 18 to defend the futurist position versus the preterist position. And I personally think that what we're seeing is the futurism is obviously in decline for whatever reason because of the decline of historical grammatical hermeneutics. That's probably due to the rise of postmodern thought that precedes hermeneutics logically in people's minds. And we're seeing the rise in the academic level of idealism and also preterism. And so Andy is going to give us a foundational basis for futurism. So, thank you.
All right. Thanks for having me. Is this on?
No.
No. Okay. The title of this session is a case for the futurist interpretation of the book of Revelation. And at first that seems like sort of a foolish title because most of us think it's self-evident that the book of Revelation is a yet future prophetic oracle. But we're living in a day, I think, when the futurist interpretation of the book of Revelation can no longer be assumed. It now has to be defended. And perhaps the most aggressive challengers to the futurist interpretation of the book of Revelation today come from the pens of partial preterists. And these folks believe that the book of Revelation was written in the mid-60s AD. Its events were mostly fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And they see the theme of the book as predicting the sacking of Jerusalem. And they basically believe that represents God's divorce and judgment upon harlotrous Old Testament Israel. Partial preterists, though, are quick to distinguish themselves from full preterists. They still hold to a future bodily coming of Christ. They still hold to a future judgment, and they still hold to a future resurrection of the unsaved. The partial preterist relies upon at least 13 ideas to argue that the bulk of the book of Revelation was fulfilled in the events surrounding AD 70. And what I'm doing in this presentation is marching through each of these 13 areas. And I'm going to juxtapose futurism with preterism, partial preterism, in each of these areas. Obviously, this is not going to be an exhaustive study, but one of the things I'm doing is I'm interacting with the writings of Kenneth Gentry, who made a contribution to a book called The Four Views of Revelation. And it's in that book he tries to set forth the partial preterist case. A lot of us, I think, as futurists, have hung our hat on the dating issue. We think that if we can disprove the preterist early date scheme, then we've won the debate. And to a large extent, that's very true. But what I'd like to show you in this presentation is it really doesn't matter where you date the book, 60s or 90s. We still win the debate because the text itself, as I'll try to demonstrate, does not naturally move in the direction of partial preterism. The text moves in the direction of futurism. So let's start with the first of these 13 categories, and this has to do with hermeneutics. And certainly in any theological controversy, there's usually a dispute over hermeneutical method, and that's certainly true with the difference between partial preterism and futurism. Let me give our side first. Our side relies upon a normal or literal method of interpretation. In other words, we are coming to the text consistently. We are not inventing a new set of hermeneutical rules when we approach the book of Revelation. We're basically using the same rules that we use in interpreting any other section of the Bible. And as a result, we take the text in a normal, literal, grammatical sense. And as Dr. Larson pointed out in the previous presentation, that in no way implies a wooden literal hermeneutic. Our opponents like to accuse us that we are sort of wooden literalists and we don't respect types and figures of speech and symbols. And so they've basically written off our hermeneutic in the area of the book of Revelation. But as you can see from the slide, we do acknowledge symbols and figures of speech when they are textually conspicuous. So we have many little clues we see in the book of Revelation that tell us that a figure of speech is in play. The adverb spiritually. The word sign or Simeon in chapter 12. The constant language of correspondence that we see all the way through the book, like or as. Old Testament correspondence helps us as well. For example, the four beasts in Revelation 13 and verse 2. We don't interpret those as literal beasts. We interpret those as nations. How do we know that? Because the Old Testament gives us a hint in Daniel 7. Sometimes we know we're working with a symbol or figure of speech because of the context. For example, the woman in Revelation 17, we don't necessarily see her as a literal woman because the end of the vision, John says, this woman represents a city. So this charge that we're sort of wooden and inflexible with our literalism really is unfounded. And when we get to these symbols and figures of speech, we basically have some rules in place that help us ferret out what these symbols and figures of speech mean. Sometimes the context interprets the symbol for us. For example, the dragon in Revelation 12 is interpreted for us as the devil. Sometimes the Old Testament will interpret the symbol for us. The woman in Revelation 12 verse 1 has a direct parallel in the Old Testament. So we'll have more to say about that later. Sometimes language of comparison that we find in a simile, basic comparative statement, helps us understand what these symbols and figures of speech mean. And basically Merrill Tenney's point, and I think I cited this on footnote 9 or so in my paper, his point is if we consistently apply this method, taking words or phrases or ideas in their ordinary sense, unless there's something textually conspicuous which is alerting us to a fact that there's a figure of speech or a symbol in play. Tenney's point is if we consistently apply this method, we logically end up as futurists. It's quite obvious as we study the book of Revelation that the events of the book have not happened yet. When has half of the world's population been destroyed as narrated in the book of Revelation? When has the greatest earthquake in human history ever taken place as narrated in the book of Revelation? There is no history for those things, so they must be yet future. Now let me contrast our method with the preterist method. And one of the things that Gentry does in his presentation is he tries to argue that the book of Revelation is a special genre or a special classification of literature. And he tries to draw parallels between the book of Revelation and non-canonical material. And this would be material that flourished in the first century and into the intertestamental period. And one of his points is that in this genre, hyperbole is common, exaggeration is common. And he basically says literalism is the exception, not the rule, in these extra biblical books. And he tries to lump that in with the book of Revelation. And this, I would phrase it this way, it's like a get out of jail for free card in a certain sense. Whenever the text of Revelation goes beyond the events of AD 70, which it does quite frequently, by the way, Gentry will say, well, this is just apocalyptic hyperbole. And if you look at footnote 12 of my paper sometime, you'll see he uses this tactic over and over and over again in his presentation. I think I cataloged there all of the times he describes Revelation as apocalyptic hyperbole. It's sort of the get out of jail for free card. That's how they're able to take the global events of the book of Revelation and, as Charlie Clough says, ram, jam, and cram those events back into the AD 70 scenario. And my point here is this, I don't think, is a valid method. I don't think it's valid to go outside the Bible, develop a hermeneutic of hyperbole and exaggeration, and read that back into the Bible. And the reason I don't think it's valid is because there are many differences, as Robert Thomas has noted, between non-canonical apocalyptic literature and the book of Revelation. The non-canonical material is pseudonymous, the book of Revelation is not. The non-canonical material is pessimistic about the present. The book of Revelation is not. The non-canonical material contains no epistles. The book of Revelation contains 7 epistles. The non-canonical material does not emphasize morality, yet the book of Revelation emphasizes morality. The word repent is used over and over again throughout the book of Revelation. The non-canonical material portrays Messiah's coming as exclusively future, but the book of Revelation does not. It focuses on the Lamb who was slain from the foundation of the earth, his first advent, and it also speaks of his second advent. The non-canonical material does not call itself prophecy, yet the book of Revelation calls itself prophecy. The non-canonical material does not even predict the future, yet the book of Revelation predicts the future. The non-canonical material primarily concerns a future generation, but the book of Revelation concerns John's generation, Revelation 2 and 3, and yet a future generation as well. So my point is, this is one of the ways that I think we can counter the preterist mentality that the book of Revelation is filled with hyperbole. They are building their hermeneutic not from within the Bible, but from outside the Bible, in areas of literature that oftentimes are going a completely different direction than where the book of Revelation is going. Let me move to a second of the 13 categories that I want to talk about this morning. And this has to do with the so-called time texts of the book of Revelation. This really is probably, when you study their writings, it's their most relied upon argument. It's probably the number one gun. And basically what they're arguing is the book of Revelation concerns these phrases: shortly, quickly, nearer at hand, about to, or on the point of. And they say, aha, this means that the contents of the book of Revelation had to have been fulfilled within John's immediate lifespan, or else these terms become sort of nonsensical. But the fact of the matter is, in response to that, is these terms, when studied, and a lot of ink has already been spilled on this, but these terms, when studied, have a very broad semantic range. They do not always mean the same thing every time they're used. It is not a technical expression or a one-size-fits-all type of expression. Sometimes these phrases can be used chronologically, indicating when. That's the meaning the preterist wants them to mean all the time. So, for example, in the New Testament, Paul says, I hope to come to you soon. There's a chronological use of the phrase. But that same phrase can also mean something adverbially or qualitatively indicating how. Sometimes it can mean when, but sometimes it can mean how. In other words, when the action comes, it's going to come with great suddenness. So in Acts 22:18, it says, leave Jerusalem quickly. It's sort of like when you go fill your car up with gasoline and you put the little credit card in the slot and the little screen comes on and says, remove your card quickly. It's kind of speaking of the speed at which you remove the card. And I think that's how a lot of these terms are used. And I think Thomas Ice has pointed out that many of these terms, tachos in particularly, occurs in the LXX, the Septuagint, in context that would not be fulfilled for hundreds or perhaps thousands of years. Isaiah 13:22, which is a prophecy of Babylon's destruction. This prophecy was probably written in the 7th century, and it wouldn't be fulfilled till 539 BC. the historic fall of Babylon. I believe Isaiah 13:22 has never been fulfilled, by the way. But notice in that large gap, the word soon or takos is inserted. That can't mean chronology there. It has to mean something different. And so I think it's speaking of quality. And it's the same with Isaiah 51 and verse 5. My righteousness is near. There's takos again in the LXX. That's a millennial text. It's never been fulfilled. And yet takos is there. So it cannot mean chronology. It must mean something adverbially. And also some of these other words, enges and melo, they can be used to communicate eminency, not necessarily chronology. Philippians 4:5, the Lord is near. In other words, when the action comes, it will come with great suddenness, but also the action could take place at any moment. That's another possible understanding of these time texts. Melo can be understood in that same way. Peter says, on one who will share in the glory, melo, or about to be revealed. In other words, it's on the verge of being revealed. It could happen at any moment. So again, it doesn't have to always indicate chronology. So my point is this. These time texts, I don't think, so-called time texts, don't pose the massive obstacle to our interpretation that our opponents say they pose. However, it poses a massive problem for their interpretation. Why? Because these same words appear not just at the beginning of the book of Revelation, but they appear at the end of the book of Revelation. In other words, for partial preterists to be consistent, they must believe that the entire book, not just part of the book, was fulfilled in AD 70. So you notice that the partial preterist has to be inconsistent in his use and in his approach to these time texts just to say the book of Revelation is not completely fulfilled. By the way, the idea of a complete fulfillment of the book is something they don't want any part of. They desperately want a second coming of Christ, bodily appearing. They desperately want a final judgment. They desperately want a final resurrection. Because the moment you say those things are all past is the moment you are in violation of all of the great ecumenical creeds of the faith, and it's the moment you move quickly into full preterism, which everyone agrees is unorthodox and heretical. So my point is not to call partial preterists heretics. We'll let Tommy Ice do that sometime. My point is to show that these partial preterists have to be inconsistent in their use of these so-called time texts just to stay within the pale of orthodoxy. Let's move to a third area. He's still recovering from what I just said. Let's move to a third area. This has to do with the so-called theme verse of the book of Revelation. I believe most of us agree that this is the theme, by the way, of the book of Revelation. It says, behold, he is coming with the clouds. Every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn over him. Now, most of us understand the theme verse of the book of Revelation to be communicating a future return of the Lord. They believe, however, that this theme verse communicates the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. They believe at this time Christ invisibly came upon Jerusalem through the Roman armies in a destruction of Jerusalem. So notice that in their system there are three comings of Christ. Once in the incarnation, first coming. Secondly, Jesus Christ came in AD 70 to destroy Jerusalem. Thirdly, there's a bodily appearing. Gentry, I'll talk more about this later, places the bodily appearing or the final coming in Revelation chapter 20 and verse 9. It's funny, these are the same people that criticize us for a two-phased view of the second coming of Christ, and yet it seems to me that they've parceled it out with 2 phases or 3 phases or whatever as well. But here's some words they rely upon to argue that Revelation 1:7 communicates the theme verse of the book of Revelation, which is the destruction of Jerusalem. Number one, they like to talk about clouds. They like to use Isaiah 19:1, which speaks of Christ coming invisibly in judgment, I think, upon Egypt. They like to focus on the word pierced, and here they're blaming the Jews for crucifying Christ. It sort of fits with what Dr. Larson was speaking of earlier. You blame the Jews for everything. They like to focus on the word tribes. They believe the word tribes refers to the land of Israel. And they like to focus on that word earth. And they're very quick to point out that earth means the land of Israel in Matthew 2 and verse 6 and other places. And there's already been a lot of ink spilled on refuting this, but let me give you the two major problems with what they're doing with Revelation 1 verse 7 from my perspective. First of all, the phrase all the tribes of the earth. This is something Greg Beale points out in his commentary in the book of Revelation. He says all the tribes of the earth, when that identical Greek phrase appears in all of its Septuagint usages, it always refers to all the nations of the world. Never once does that phrase, all the tribes of the earth, just refer to the local land of Israel. Another problem, I think, is what they're doing with the word earth. And I agree with them that that Greek word earth can mean the local land of Israel in a few contexts, such as Matthew 2 and verse 6. But what they don't tell you is this word has a global nuance. Genesis 1:1 in the LXX, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That means everything, not just the local land of Israel. Jesus said in Matthew 5 and verse 18, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Their earth, again, is used in a global context. Even in Revelation itself, earth is used globally. Revelation 21 and verse 1, John says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. That's speaking of everything. Even, here's the clincher, a few verses earlier than Revelation 1:7, we have Revelation 1:5, which says Jesus is ruling and reigning over the kings of the earth. Again, a global nuance. So basically what you see happening is the preterists are developing the meaning of a term from a totally unrelated context. And they're beaming it back into our present context. I think it was James Barr who called that hermeneutical sin. I call it a sin, but he didn't use that kind of language. But he called it illegitimate totality transfer. And one of James Barr's main contributions was that the meanings of words do not come from isolated contexts somewhere else in the Bible. They come from the immediate context. Words only have meanings to the extent that we can understand the context that those words appear in. And I think the context of the book of Revelation is clearly global. The catastrophic judgments are global. Every eye will see Him is a global expression. Therefore, I think the global meaning of the term, rather than the local meaning of the term, best fits in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 7. Let's move to a fourth area. And this issue has to do with the relevance of the book of Revelation to the seven churches of Asia Minor. And here's the criticism that's made against our camp. They believe that our interpretation, which places Revelation 4 through 22 in the distant future, makes the book irrelevant to the struggling churches of Asia Minor. And basically they'll say things like, we're teasing those churches. We are engaging in a cruel mockery of the circumstances of those churches because we are placing their relief so far into the distant future. But the fact of the matter is our interpretation, which does place Revelation 4 through 22 in the future, in a next generation, a further generation, a generation removed from the seven churches, our interpretation is just following the pattern of the Old Testament prophets. Is this not what the Old Testament prophets consistently did? They comforted God's people in the present by providing them with a vision to be fulfilled in the distant future. Is that not what Isaiah is doing in Isaiah 40 through 66? Isaiah in that section is not speaking to his own generation. He's speaking to a distant generation. The same with Ezekiel 34 through 48. The same with the verses at the end of the book of Amos. The same with the second burden of Zechariah. And John is simply doing the same thing. It's interesting that even their interpretation of the book of Revelation grasps this principle, that God sometimes comforts people in the present with a vision that's to be fulfilled in the distant future. This is what they say. Smyrna, Jesus is speaking to Smyrna. He's comforting the believers there that they will not be hurt by the second death. Well, where do we find a development of the second death? We find it in Revelation 20, verse 14, which is futuristic according to Gentry's partial preterist interpretation. The same with Sardis. Jesus comforts the church at Sardis by saying that their names will not be taken out of the book of life. Where do we find references to the book of life? In Revelation 20 and verse 15. That's where the concept is developed, which is in the futuristic section of the partial preterist interpretation. Gentry takes Revelation 20, verses 7 through 15 as future, and here I'm grabbing material from his section of the book that he sees as future, and I'm showing here that even he recognizes this idea that Christ comforts people in the present by furnishing them with a vision to be fulfilled in the distant future. I don't think it's our view that has the audience relevance issue, by the way. I think they've got a problem with audience relevance, not us. Why would I say that? They believe that the contents of the book primarily were fulfilled in Jerusalem. Now that's, I think, about 800 miles removed from the 7 churches in Asia Minor. So it's not our view that makes the book irrelevant to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, it's their view. The contents of Revelation 13, they take that as basically the Neronian persecution. Most scholars believe the Neronian persecution was local. And again, that is hundreds and hundreds of miles removed from the 7 churches in Asia Minor. So it's very interesting that the things that they accuse us of, in their interpretation, when we look at it carefully, they are making that same error. This is how Robert Thomas puts it. I have the quote there at the top of the screen. Thomas says, what does a localized judgment hundreds of miles away have to do with the 7 churches of Asia? The promise to shield the Philadelphian church from judgment, and there he's quoting Revelation 3 verses 10 and 11, is meaningless if that judgment occurs far beyond the borders of the city. We don't have the problem with audience relevance. Our view follows in the pattern of the prophets. Their view, I think, has a problem with audience relevance. Let me get to something that is highly controversial, and this is the 5th area. And this has to do with the 7-sealed scroll in Revelation 5. Most of us understand that 7-sealed scroll is maybe the title deed to the earth. It introduces temporal discipline upon the nation of Israel, but in the end, the nation of Israel is restored. She is returned to a place of preeminence. That's basically how we, for the most part, understand this 7-sealed scroll. But to them, this scroll is a divorce decree. It's a decree of divorce where God permanently severed His relations with national Israel. And as a result, God is now raising up something new. They call it the international church or the kingdom, which is to replace defunct and judged Israel, which has rejected her Messiah. People say, well, is this replacement theology? Yeah, this is replacement theology on steroids, so to speak. One of the things they do is they try to build a relationship between the scroll of Revelation 5 and the scroll of Ezekiel 2 and 3. And Gentry says, aha, the scroll of Ezekiel 2 and 3 brought in the Babylonian captivity, the destruction of Jerusalem. So the scroll of Revelation 5 must be speaking of a final destruction of Israel. The basic problem, of course, is preterists, for whatever reason, they don't read the whole book of Ezekiel. They are very fond at quoting a little section here and there. Everyone agrees that when you look at the entire book, the book of Ezekiel has 3 parts. Chapters 1 through 24, judgment upon Judah. Chapters 25 through 32, judgment upon the nations. Chapters 33 through 48, those are the chapters they don't talk about. The restoration of Israel. The valley of the dry bones, chapter 36, the 2 sticks coming together. The glory of God re-entering the millennial temple. So the scroll of Ezekiel 2 and 3 does not communicate a final severance or a final divorce. What it communicates is temporal discipline eventually leading to the nation's restoration. And my suggestion is that is how John is using the scroll of Revelation 5. He's not using it to communicate divorce at all. He's using it to communicate temporal discipline leading to restoration. This whole idea of a divorce of Israel should be very troubling to us because it has at its core a complete misunderstanding of the Abrahamic covenant, which is an unconditional covenant, which is the foundation of God's whole program for the nation of Israel and for the world, for that matter. Walvoord, in his book, The Millennial Kingdom, gives 5 reasons why that covenant, beginning in Genesis 15, is unconditional. In other words, it's something that God is going to bring to pass for the nation. It's not contingent upon the nation's performance. Walvoord says, number 1, look at ancient Near East covenant ratification ceremony. He notes how in Genesis 15, God alone, as represented by the oven and the torch, passed through the animal pieces while Abraham was asleep. If that doesn't communicate unconditionality, I really don't know what will. Walvoord points out how there's no stated conditions for Israel's obedience in Genesis 15. If this is somehow a conditional covenant, what is Israel supposed to do to fulfill the covenant? Nothing is stated. Walvoord says this covenant is called eternal 3 times in Genesis 17. It's called immutable once in Hebrews 6. If you're going to call a covenant eternal and immutable, it's got to rest totally upon the character of an eternal and immutable God, not upon fickle man and fickle man's performance. Walvoord points out how this covenant keeps getting reaffirmed transgenerationally, despite Israel's disobedience throughout the Old Testament. In fact, we have that great promise in Jeremiah 31, right after the new covenant. Jeremiah says, as long as there's sun, moon, and stars, Israel will be a perpetual nation before me. Now, what's interesting about that statement is made as the nation is on the verge of going into discipline through the Babylonian captivity. So, the fact that this covenant keeps getting reaffirmed over and over again to a disobedient people throughout the pages of the Old Testament demonstrates that it's eternal. One of the little games that's being played, so to speak, is they say, well, yes, maybe that's true, but the land promises and the covenant language was fulfilled in the time of Joshua or Solomon. And this is very common in preterist literature to run into this type of thing. And they like to use the end of Joshua 11 and the end of Joshua 21 where it says, Joshua attained all the land. People say, aha, the language of the covenant is fulfilled. But again, these people have a difficult time reading the entire book because all you do is go a chapter or 2 to the right. And you get to Joshua 13 and it says, this is all of the land that they did not possess. Furthermore, the land gained in the conquest was only a fraction of what was promised in the Abrahamic covenant. Here's a chart I found. This chart is depicting the borders of the land in Numbers 34 on the verge of the conquest with everything that was promised in the Abrahamic covenant. And how can anybody, when they understand this, think that the covenant was fulfilled during the conquest era? Did you know Jerusalem wasn't even captured in the time of Joshua? Jerusalem, according to Joshua 15:63, would not fall into Jewish hands, I think, until about 400 years later, until the time of David in 2 Samuel 5. Furthermore, how could this covenant have been fulfilled in the time of Solomon when God said the nation would possess the land forever? Forever is a long time. Yet the nation was evicted from the land just a few centuries after the time of Solomon. So that forever requirement has never been satisfied. If the covenant language was fulfilled in the time of Solomon, then what in the world is Amos talking about a couple centuries later, where Amos comes along and reaffirms the language of the covenant? So my point in bringing up all of this is when we understand the nature of the Abrahamic covenant, when we understand its unconditional nature, when we understand that it is unfulfilled, it makes the idea of a divorce of national Israel laughable. And by the way, that doesn't make me sad at all that God has not divorced Israel. Because if God is not going to divorce Israel, guess who else He's not going to divorce? He's not going to divorce me for my disobedience. And so it makes me happy that God is going to fulfill His promises to Israel. It doesn't make me upset like it does some of our theological opponents. Let's move to a sixth area. And this has to do with the 144,000 in Revelation 7. We, for the most part, understand the 144,000 as Jews who will evangelize the world during the coming tribulation period. They believe, though, and this is how Gentry phrases it, that Revelation 7 is sort of a pause in the action. In other words, God has been wiping out Israel all the way through the book of Revelation in AD 70, and then God kind of stops and steps back and starts to form what Gentry calls the new Israel, or the church, to permanently replace harlotrous Israel that is being judged in AD 70. And I think there are several problems with this interpretation. For one thing, they have to deliteralize the number 144,000. One of the things that Hank Hanegraaff does in his book, The Apocalypse Code, is he tries to argue that the 144,000, as described at the beginning of the chapter, are the same group of people as the innumerable multitude that are described at the end of chapter 7. But look at the differences between these groups. In the first group, they're numbered. In the second group, they're innumerable. In the first group, they're Jews. In the second group, they're all nations. In the first group, they're sealed. In the second group, they're slain. In the first group, they're sealed before the tribulation. In the second group, they're converted out of the tribulation. This is not the same group of people. The idea that a person can claim to be reading the book of Revelation, as Hanegraaff says, with the background music of the Old Testament ringing in his ears, to me is very difficult to understand, because the Old Testament always presents these tribes as literal, geographical, political entities. If I'm claiming that my reading of the book of Revelation is informed by the Old Testament, and the Old Testament always portrays these tribes as literal, beginning in Genesis 29 and 30, why wouldn't I see them as literal tribes in Revelation 7? Furthermore, to deliteralize the number 144,000 is difficult because John knows how to use indefinite phrases when he wants to. He knows how to say a large group, which he says in chapter 7 and verse 9, an innumerable multitude. But he doesn't do that at the beginning of the chapter. He gives a specific number. He gives us specific tribes. And then he says 12,000 from each tribe. How can this group be the church when the word church is virtually absent in Revelation 4 through 22? Ecclesia is used 18 times in Revelation 1 through 3, and then the word disappears from the book. And it's not until John sort of signs off at the end when he says, preach these things in the churches, that he mentions ecclesia again. So the word church is not in the chapter. The word church is virtually absent in chapters 4 through 22. How can you fit the global language of Revelation 7 and verse 9 into the past? It's very difficult to do. There's 4 terms that are used there: nations, peoples, tribes, tongues. That's the same language that's used in a few chapters earlier in Revelation 5 and verse 9, describing those for whom Christ died. Christ died for the world. He died for everyone. Therefore, Revelation 7 and verse 9, and the use of those same 4 words, indicates global language, and so we can't cram it back into the first century. Hanegraaff dismisses the futuristic interpretation on the grounds that the tribes were lost in 722 BC and AD 70 and therefore could not be regathered as demanded by a futuristic interpretation of the passage. My response to that is that these tribes may be lost to man, but they are not lost to God. The fact of the matter is, James chapter 1 verse 1 and Acts 26 verse 7 both mention the 12 tribes, which would include those 10 northern tribes that were supposedly lost, and those words were written long after the events of 7 22. This argument sort of reminds me of the Sadducees, who would say, well, we just don't believe God can resurrect the dead. They just count it off in unbelief. But we have an omnipotent God who can keep track of these tribes and bring these tribes back in His timetable. Let's move to a seventh area, and this has to do with the temple of Revelation chapter 11. Most of us understand this temple as the future Antichrist's temple that will be desecrated by the Antichrist midway through the tribulation period. The Preterist, though, has a different view on this, as you might expect. They believe that this temple is the Herodian temple, which was standing in the time of John, supposedly. And basically what they're arguing here is that in order for John to recount information about the temple had to have been contemporary to his own lifetime. It's something that had to have been standing, something that he could see, and therefore that's how he knew about it and wrote about it. There's several problems with their interpretation, though. For one thing, it is possible for a biblical writer to see a temple in a vision when the temple is not yet standing at the time. Is that not what Ezekiel and Daniel, those two exilic prophets, did? Notice when Ezekiel's temple visions took place, 573. Daniel's temple visions take place in 551, 538, 536. That's all from chronological information given in their books. Now, what's interesting about that is we know that the temple itself was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 and would not be rebuilt by Zerubbabel until 515. So the fact is that both Ezekiel and Daniel had all of their temple visions when there was actually no tangible temple structure standing in Jerusalem. And if Ezekiel and Daniel could see a future temple, why can't John? John could be doing the same thing, especially since everyone agrees that John is writing in the tradition of Daniel and Ezekiel. Furthermore, how could John be recounting contemporary information about the temple in Jerusalem when he is 800 miles removed on the Isle of Patmos at the time? So that seems sort of strange to me. If this temple is something that took place in AD 70, if this is the Herodian temple, then where are you going to fit the rest of the contents of the book of Revelation 11? Revelation 11 talks about two witnesses who are slain. They're gazed at by the entire world. They lie dead for 3.5 days. They resurrect. They ascend. Now, you could be the greatest student of Josephus you want to be, but you're not going to find anything like this in the language of Josephus. And of course, what Gentry does at this point is he gets very spiritual with his interpretation. He says these two witnesses probably represent a small body of Christians who remained in Jerusalem to testify against the temple. They are portrayed as two in that they are legal witnesses to the covenant curses. But is this not a case of special pleading? You can't demand a literal temple in Revelation 11 verses 1 and 2 and then switch your hermeneutic right in the middle of the chapter and argue that these two witnesses are somehow allegorical or spiritual of something. One of the more controversial things that Gentry says in regarding Revelation 11, he says when the Herodian temple was destroyed in AD 70, it brought to an end the times of the Gentiles. And basically what he's saying here is that the Gentiles could no longer trample on the material worship of God at that point, because now the material worship of God would no longer be located in Jerusalem, but will be located in the international church. And so he believes that the times of the Gentiles ended in AD 70. But what he does is he does an inconsistent reading of the statue in Daniel 2, which is the part of the Scripture that enumerates for us what these times of the Gentiles actually are. He says that the beginning of the statue, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, he thinks all of those are literal entities during the times of the Gentiles. But then you get down to the feet of clay and the 10 toes and the smiting stone, which smashes the base of the statue, causing the whole statue to crumble. He suddenly becomes spiritual in his interpretation. So he's reading the first part of the statue with one hermeneutical lens. He reads the vision material at the end of the statue, at the end of the chapter, at the bottom of the statue with a different hermeneutical lens. Dr. Pentecost gives 6 reasons with associating the smiting stone of the statue in Daniel 2 with the first coming of Christ. Pentecost says that when Christ died and rose again, at that time, Christianity did not suddenly fill the whole earth, as Daniel 2 requires. At that time, Rome was not destroyed, as Daniel 2 requires. At that time, Rome did not consist of 10 simultaneous kings. Christ in the New Testament is never even called a smiting stone. He's called a stumbling stone, a cornerstone, but not a smiting stone. The smiting stone aspect of his ministry awaits the future. In Christ's first advent, he did not put an end to the earthly kingdoms of the world. In Christ's first advent, he did not usher in a political kingdom. So these are just some of the general problems in terms of inconsistency with this idea that the times of the Gentiles sort of ended in AD 70. Let's move on to an 8th area. And this has to do with the woman in Revelation 12, the woman fleeing in the wilderness. Most of us understand this woman as the nation of Israel, as she is being pursued by the dragon or Satan during the second half of Daniel's 70th week. But the preterist does not look at it that way. They believe the woman represents the first century church. Here's how Gentry puts it. In Revelation 12, John backs up chronologically in order to show the mother church, that's my emphasis there, the mother church in Jerusalem, which was being protected from Satan-inspired resistance. This would cover the time frame from Christ's ministry through the book of Acts up until the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. I think there's 4 problems, though, with saying that this woman is the church. Number 1, the word church doesn't appear in the chapter and is virtually absent in chapters 4 through 22. We've already talked about that. Number 2, you have a chronological problem. Here the woman is portrayed as giving birth to Christ. The Christian community did not give birth to Christ. Furthermore, there's a direct parallel with Genesis 37, verses 9 and 10. Where the sun and the moon and the 12 stars have a direct parallel in Genesis 37, verses 9 and 10 to the matriarch, the patriarch, and the 12 tribes of Israel. It's a clear reference to Israel. Number 4, where do you put the miracles in this chapter in the events of AD 70? The miracles are such a grand scale. The ground opens up, for example. In fact, in Revelation 12, verse 14, it says this woman is clothed with the wings of the great eagle. Trace that imagery sometime. It'll take you right back to Exodus 19, verse 4. And it's a description of what God did for Israel in the Exodus event, how He protected Israel supernaturally. And we read about all of those great miracles in that Exodus event. The Red Sea parting, the preservation in the wilderness, the plagues. And I think the same imagery is being used here by John because he's basically saying here the same thing's about to happen. God is going to supernaturally protect Israel from the wrath of the dragon in the 7-year tribulation period in a grand scale, as grand as the Exodus event itself. And certainly nothing like that happened in AD 70. Let's move to a 9th area. And this has to do with the beast of Revelation 13. Most of us understand this beast as the future Antichrist. Preterist literature, Gentry in particular, understands this beast. He actually wrote a whole book on this subject. He understands this beast as Nero, the person of Nero. And of course, one of the things that's heavily relied upon is gematria, or the idea that alphabets of the ancient world had a phonetic purpose and they had a numerical purpose. And so basically you could take a person's name in the ancient world and total up all of the numbers of all of the letters of a person's name, and you could give everybody a number in terms of what their name added up to. And here's the thing that he says. It's very interesting. He says when you take the Greek title, Caesar Nero, transliterate that into Hebrew, and then add up all of the names in that matrix, it comes out to 666. And I've known some lay people that really are gravitated by this, people that really don't understand a lot about the Bible. They're pulled in by this because it looks so sophisticated. But let me give you a couple of problems. There's already been a lot of ink spilled on this, but just the four basic problems as I see it. Number one, there's an inconsistent use of numbers going on here. Preterists are the first to lecture us about the number 144,000, how that's a non-literal number, how the number 1,000 in Revelation 20 is a non-literal number, and then all of a sudden, right in the middle of this kind of lecturing they do, their hermeneutic totally shifts. 606 is such a literal number in their minds that you can actually use it to identify a person's name. So it's an interesting inconsistency. Secondly, why are we transliterating from the Greek into Hebrew to get this thing to work when John is writing to a Greek-speaking audience, to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, who are a primarily Greek-speaking audience? Well, the reason they want to push this into Hebrew is because the name Nero doesn't come out to 666. It comes out to like 1,005 or something. And what good would that be? We need a 666, not 1,005. So we've got to shift this to Hebrew to make it work. One of the responses to that is, well, the book of Revelation is a Hebraic book. And that's true. It is Hebraic. It has a heavy Jewish emphasis. But one of the things you notice when you study the book is when John wants to insert a Hebrew word or a meaning of a word, he makes that conspicuous. He tells you what he's doing. So he says, Abaddon, which in the Hebrew is, or which in the Hebrew is Armageddon. He gives you a little textual clue. But there is no textual clue like that in Revelation 13, verse 18. There's really not the slightest hint to the casual Bible reader that we are to find this solution in Hebrew rather than Greek. Furthermore, there's a little bit of cherry picking going on here. Greg Beale in his commentary points out how there are many ways to spell Nero. There are many ways, different ways to spell Caesar. There's some debate as to why they're even bringing in the title into this formula. But you notice what's happening is they've cherry-picked a peculiar Neronian spelling to fit a predetermined outcome. Besides all that, it's very difficult to fit all of the events of Revelation 13 and connect them with Nero. Nero did not usher in persecution for exactly 42 months. Gentry at this point says, well, it's close to 42 months. He uses little phrases like, but for a few days. And by my way of thinking, close is a pretty good rule in horseshoes and hand grenades. I don't necessarily think it works too well in the area of Bible prophecy. I'm looking for exact fulfillments. Nero did not control the entire planet. He did not force people to receive a mark on their right hand or forehead in order to participate in the global economy. He did not coerce the entire world to worship a singular image of him. Notice in verse 15, the image is singular. One of the things Gentry does is he brings up extra biblical sources where multiple images of Nero were worshipped. But that really doesn't fit because here we're talking about a singular image. Nero did not resurrect from the dead. He did not associate with a miracle-working false prophet. He did not receive global veneration. It's sort of interesting that when our side takes material in the Bible, a few connections, and we equate it with something going on in the newspaper, and we ignore all the discrepancies, we are quickly accused of newspaper exegesis. And sometimes that criticism is a valid criticism. Dr. Larson made reference to that in his presentation. But my point is that aren't preterists here doing newspaper exegesis of a sense? They're just not using a 21st century newspaper. They're using a 1st century newspaper. And all of us can do newspaper exegesis when we find a few similarities, but we ignore all of the differences. Let's move to a 10th point. And this has to do with the Babylonian harlot in Revelation 17 and 18. Most of us in this group understand this harlot as some kind of future system or city which will dominate the world in the coming tribulation period. The preterist, on the other hand, believes that this harlot is first century Jerusalem, which was destroyed in AD 70. Of all of their arguments, there are two primary arguments that they keep using on this. The first argument that they like to use is the phrase great city. And they say, aha, great city refers to Jerusalem in chapter 11 and verse 8. Therefore, the same phrase great city must refer to Jerusalem also in chapter 18 and verse 10. But again, notice the illegitimate totality transfer at work, defining great city from how it's used in a foreign context, far removed from Revelation 18. Who's to say, by the way, that there can't be two great cities? John nowhere says there's only one great city. Maybe there's a great city, Jerusalem, and a great city, Babylon. I don't even think this phrase great city uniquely identifies Jerusalem, because Babylon is called Babylon the Great by Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4, a great city. Josephus calls Rome a great city. Second argument they use is this harlot imagery. And basically the argument that they're employing here is Jerusalem, they think, is always referred to as a harlot in the pages of the Old Testament. Therefore, when the same harlot imagery shows up in Revelation 17 and 18, it also must be talking about Jerusalem as well. But the fact of the matter is, harlot imagery does not uniquely define Jerusalem. Sometimes Gentile cities are called harlots. Both Tyre and Nineveh, when you study Isaiah and Nahum, are called harlots, and those are Gentile cities. There's some other problems with equating Babylon of Revelation 17 and 18 and Jerusalem. First, I think it's possible that Babylon should retain its ordinary meaning. I think Babylon means Babylon. It's interesting that when we study the book of Revelation, areas of geography are very literal. Patmos, Asia, the seven churches, Euphrates, Armageddon. Those are all literal places. Why shouldn't Babylon not be given the same literal designation? When John wants to communicate spiritually, he's got a formula for that, as in 11:8, which spiritually means. But he doesn't use that here in Revelation 17, and he doesn't use it in Revelation 18. It's very interesting that in preterist literature, Babylon means Babylon, and Jerusalem means Jerusalem all the way through the Scripture. And then suddenly you get to Revelation 17 and 18, and those two terms merge. So you don't necessarily have a stability of meaning from the Old Testament to the New Testament in the preterist material. Greg Beale says there's not a single example in the Bible or outside the Bible of Babylon ever being used as a code word for Jerusalem. Furthermore, what do you do with the unfulfilled prophecies regarding Babylon? Jeremiah 50 and 51 depicts the destruction of Babylon in such a way that I believe it demands a future fulfillment. Where is it going to be fulfilled? It's fulfilled, I believe, in Revelation 17 and 18. That's why Charles Dyer has drawn so many parallels between Jeremiah 50 and 51 and Revelation 17 and 18. But wait a minute, if Babylon has now become Jerusalem, where do we find a fulfillment for Jeremiah 50 and 51? Well, what they do is they say, well, that's Jeremiah 50 and 51, that was fulfilled in 539, the historic fall of Babylon. So if you preterize one section of Scripture, you've got to preterize another section of Scripture. But even if we do that, where are you going to put Zechariah 5? Which also depicts a future for Babylon. And by the way, this has nothing to do with 539. You say, how do you know that? It was written 20 years after 539. So this is a prophecy that is unfulfilled, and there's no logical place for that prophecy to be fulfilled if Babylon has suddenly become Jerusalem. Furthermore, there are many points of dissimilarity between the harlot of Revelation 17 and 18 and first century Jerusalem. First century Jerusalem did not sit on many waters. She did not reign over the kings of the earth. She didn't even reign over herself. She was under the thumb of Rome. She was not an economic power. First century Jerusalem is not the source of all harlotry. Jerusalem didn't even become a Jewish city until the time of David. How could she be the source of all harlotry in the world? Furthermore, the text says that Babylon will never be rebuilt again. How can that be referring to Jerusalem when there's people living in Jerusalem today? It's a little odd. Why would I try to develop a hermeneutic where I try so hard to make a Jerusalem equals Babylon formula fit that I try to draw parallels with Ezekiel 16? That's what Hanegraaff does in the Apocalypse Code. He tries to connect Revelation 17 and 18 with Ezekiel 16. Why would I do that, though, when there's many clearer parallels with Jeremiah 50 and 51? Number 11, and we're getting close to wrapping up here. Christ's 1,000-year reign, Revelation 20. We as futurists basically understand the millennium as an earthly kingdom that will follow the second coming of Christ. Preterists, though, now this is Gentry's version of preterism, which is postmillennialism. His version is that the millennium basically is a spiritual kingdom. It's a kingdom that began in the ministry of Christ. It's a kingdom that proved itself in Jerusalem's destruction in AD 70. It's a kingdom which will permanently replace the nation of Israel that was judged in AD 70. And it's a kingdom that is continuing right on to the present day. And it's a kingdom which will continue until the second advent of Christ. He places the second advent of Christ in Revelation 20 and verse 9. So you notice he's mixing here, and Dr. Larson brought this up, idealism and preterism. He, by his own admission, claims he's no longer a complete preterist at this point. But I think there's at least 4 problems with a spiritualized millennium. For one thing, you have to deliteralize the number 1,000. I think that's hard to do because Revelation 20 and verse 3, John demonstrates an aptitude for using indefinite phrases when he wants to. He says a short time. John could have said a long time if he wanted to communicate an age, but he doesn't do that. He gives a concrete number. Furthermore, to argue that the Davidic kingdom is in progress at the present time, I don't think is an idea which is sustainable in the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation nowhere portrays Christ as currently reigning on David's throne. In fact, Revelation 5 verse 10 says they will reign future on the earth, a future earthly kingdom. In Revelation 12 verse 5, we learn that Jesus in his present session is on the Father's throne, which is quite distinct from the Davidic throne. Jesus himself in Revelation 3 verse 21, this would be about 60 years after Pentecost, if you follow a late date scenario, drew a sharp distinction between the throne that he was currently on in his present session and the future Davidic throne. Another problem with this spiritualized millennium is what Gentry is doing with the 2 resurrections. In Revelation 20 verses 4 and 5, he says the first resurrection is regeneration, and the second resurrection is a physical resurrection. But the same verb, to come to life, is used in both verses. Why would the verb mean one thing in verse 4 and something completely different in verse 5? Anastasis, the word that's used there, always refers to physical resurrection in all of its usages, except for Luke 2, where it's a completely different context. But that word never refers to regeneration. If the first resurrection is a spiritual resurrection, you have another problem because you've got people who are beheaded for the cause of Christ before they even become Christians. That's a slight problem, to say the least. Another problem with the spiritualized millennium is he's got to put the second advent in Revelation 20 and verse 9, after the millennium or postmillennialism. And I've looked at Revelation 20 and verse 9 very carefully, and for the life of me, I can't see the bodily return anywhere in that verse. I see a direct judgment of God from heaven to the earth, but I don't necessarily see the bodily return of Christ there. Let's move to, and by the way, real quickly, with the deliteralized millennium, there's a great appeal that's made to Psalm 50 and verse 10. For every beast of the field is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. And they say, aha, doesn't God own the cattle on the 1,001st hill? The number 1,000 is obviously a symbolic number. And here the number 1,000 is symbolic, but notice this is a totally different context. This is the parallelism in Hebrew poetry where we take both lines together. It's a different genre, so to speak, and we can't take that genre and read it back into Revelation 20, which does not have the same parallel poetic structure. Number 12, and we're getting very close to wrapping up here. There I'm using the word quickly, sort of like a futurist uses the word quickly. Is the eternal state. Most of us understand the eternal state as a new creation that follows the millennium, it follows the final judgment, and it follows the destruction of this present world. But the preterist believes that the eternal state is a spiritual new creation. Now, this is Gentry specifically, a spiritual new creation that began in the first century. They believe, again, this is the international kingdom or the international church that replaces God's unfaithful, harlotrous wife, Israel. So they believe the eternal state actually began in the first century and continues all the way into eternity. But to hold to that position, what do you have to believe? You have to believe that today there's no Satan, no sea, no death, crying, or pain, no sun, no moon, no night, no evil, no curse. And I don't know how to describe their view, except this is a very wildly allegorical view. It really makes me long for the good old days. I mean, I remember back in the good old days, we used to debate whether we're in the millennial kingdom or not. I long for that debate, post-mill, a-mill, pre-mill. With this debate, it's totally different. The debate is whether we are in the eternal state or not. So it's a movement away even from post-millennialism into what's called transmillennialism. Last point to bring up is the concluding exhortation in Revelation 22 and verse 10. This is number 13. Preterists use the juxtaposition of the command given to Daniel to seal up the vision and the command given to John in Revelation 22:10 to not seal up the vision to teach that John's prophecy had to be fulfilled within John's lifespan. But surely preterists are reading more into that passage than what really is there. Because John, when you look at the language closely, is never told to unseal the vision. He is told to unseal the words of the prophecy. Just as Daniel is never told to seal up the prophecy, he is told to seal up the words of the prophecy. So it's not the vision that's unsealed, it's the words themselves that are unsealed. And I think what that means, and I'm getting this from Geisler, one of his online articles, what that means is not that the prophecy had to be fulfilled within John's lifespan, but now the prophecy could be understood for the first time. The canon of Scripture had now come to a conclusion. The full realm of doctrine had been given. And now it was possible for people and diligent Bible students to put together the pieces of the puzzle and understand and correlate Daniel and John. And now for the first time, the prophecy is something that could be understood, not that it had to be fulfilled itself within John's lifespan. In conclusion, I think futurism still holds up under close scrutiny. The arguments relied upon by futurism's closest rival, preterism, are specious and unconvincing. The very arguments used to contend for an AD 70 fulfillment actually end up favoring a futurist interpretation.
Okay, we have about 20 minutes for questions and comments. Okay.
First of all, Andy, great job. Just tremendous presentation, really. Of all the presentations on preterism we've heard over the years, this was really thorough, excellent. Somebody should give it to Hank. Speaking of which, you briefly touched on this, and I already had it to ask you, but you didn't elaborate on it, so I'll give you a chance now. I'm holding Hank's book, The Apocalypse Code. He says this on page 235.
Having my book.
Where he...
Let me around. Never mind.
He refers to what you touched on, Ezekiel 16 and Revelation 17. Let me just read it to you.
What page are you on?
I'm on page 235.
We both came for battle, I guess.
That's right. This is the section where he's drawing the parallel between Babylon and Revelation 17 to Jerusalem. He says here, the harlot, he says boldly, that nation is ancient Israel. And then on the second paragraph, he states this, and I quote, anyone who has read the Bible even once must surely have flashbacks to the graphic images of apostate Israel when they first encounter the great prostitute of Revelation. From the Pentateuch to the prophets, the image is repeated endlessly. The biblical link, here's pertaining to the question, the biblical link between Ezekiel 16 and Revelation 17 in itself is enough to preclude misidentification. Had LaHaye interpreted Scripture in light of Scripture, the Roman Catholic Church would not even have suffered another yet gratuitous broadside. I've just reread Ezekiel 16. You did touch on it.
Yeah.
I mean, it is so... just comment on that. Ezekiel 16 and Revelation 17, he says that anybody can see the biblical link between those two passages.
Okay, I think LaHaye has read the Bible. I think, though, he's reading Jeremiah 50 and 51 with Revelation 17 and 18, which to me is a much tighter fit, particularly since both sections of Scripture have the same name. I mean, why would I? It just doesn't compute to me why I would run off to some other section of Scripture that's named totally different and try to draw parallels. So he may have a point of correspondence or two, but that's nothing like with what Charles Dyer has done here, where he's connected Revelation 17 and 18 with Jeremiah 50 and 51. I think you guys, Tommy, made that point in your new book, Breaking the Apocalypse Code. I think you or Mark wrote, why would I search for a connection to Ezekiel 16 and Revelation 17 and 18 when the connection is already very clear in Jeremiah 50 and 51 and Revelation 17 and 18. He only has one point of correspondence, really, and that's the harlot imagery. Yeah. Right. But Gentile cities are sometimes called harlots. I'll grant the fact that the dominant harlot imagery is Jerusalem, but that does not seal the deal because there's other factors at work. As Gentile cities, I think it's Tyre in Isaiah 23, verse 16, and Nineveh in Nahum chapter 3 and verse 4 are Gentile cities that they're called harlots.
Yeah, and it's getting pretty close to noon, and Paul Harvey and the rest of the story comes on about now. And you wonder why he doesn't read the rest of the story about God taking back Israel. You know, those are totally missing, you know, in Hosea, for example. Chapters 3, and then again later in the book, he marries her back, and he takes her back. Instead, he says that he divorces her and takes a new wife, the church, the true Israel, and all of that kind of stuff. And then he says he doesn't believe in replacement theology because he says that Israel was never really Israel. Israel is simply a term that refers to the people of God. So ethnic Jews were never ethnic Jews. So he's not a replacement theologian, he says. You know, yeah, and we're racist. Tim LaHaye's a racist and a sexist. Wait till Beverly hears about that. A racist and a sexist. I think she's heard about that, hasn't she?
Well,
No.
I would just say if this is not replacement theology, I really don't know what it looks like then.
Right.
Because, as I said, this is replacement theology on steroids.
Yeah, it's historically that,
Yeah.
whether a certain person wants to take the label or not. You know, it certainly fits the historical view. Any
Yeah,
other?
One quick thing. It's
Okay.
it's interesting on the transferring that replacement theologians do. Have you noticed they transfer all of Israel's blessings, but never the curses? So it's a little bit selective.
Charmaine Barker, I have a question about Gentry. What church is he affiliated with?
The Presbyterian Church of America, PCA Presbyterian, conservative group.
Typically, what I've heard in the Church of Christ is predominantly a preterist view.
Right.
But then I have to ask questions even to get that, because it's really not even studied that much. The most I've heard about the 7 churches, what they're really an example of how we are or should not be, in this century. But I truly appreciate your presentation, and I.
Thank you. I think one of the things, Tom, you can correct me on this, is that in the Church of Christ, you're going to run not just into partial preterism, but full.
Yeah.
Don Preston, isn't he an ex-Church of Christ?
Yeah, the churches of Christ, while I'm sure she's right, most are not that interested in eschatology. Those that are tend to move toward the preterist view. And who's that guy out in Ohio back in the 50s and 60s that developed full preterism and brought it into the churches of Christ? Yeah. Oh, goodness, I can't remember his name. Yeah, Max King, thank you. I believe he's still alive. He's writing books this thick. And I found over the years, you have to write books that thick to make a case for preterism, because you can't make it simply. But they are the source of modern full preterism that has come over from J. Stuart Russell. Not that others haven't adopted full preterism, but they kind of got the ball going. And many churches of Christ individuals are champions of full preterism, and they believe that we're in the new heavens and new earth, and some of them even believe that the rapture happened 3.5 years before August of AD 70. And that's why the early church didn't know about preterism. A literal rapture. So that would be 4 comings for them. And that they attack partial preterists oftentimes for being inconsistent, and things like that. And David Chilton, who was a partial preterist, a few years before he died, converted to full preterism, and a number of Presbyterians have become full preterists as well. But when they become a full preterist, their whole theology shifts away from traditional Reformed theology, needless to say, to the preterism, and you have to reinterpret everything. In fact, it's impacting the creationist movement. You go to preterist sites, and they say that, some of us believe in a 6-day creation, and, if we're going to sit and interpret the word land and Israel and all this other stuff a certain way, in a preterist way, it's inconsistent for us to take an early earth view, in Genesis. Or it's inconsistent to have a literal Genesis, because we're not taking a literal... So their protology, the study of things at the beginning, they're reading their eschatology and their hermeneutic back into it. And many of them chide others who are 6-day creationists, for example. And so this is having a tremendous impact. And I think the reason is because of the postmodern irrationalism philosophy that dominates the culture, that predisposes people to a shadowy or less literal hermeneutic. Go ahead.
Sir, I'm interested in is if there's any book on the futurist viewpoint through history And something that's very basic, ABC, that when you're talking to somebody that does not have a lot of Bible doctrine, that you can give them something that's very clear and really explains the futurist viewpoint so that they can grow in grace and in the knowledge of our Lord and Jesus Christ.
Well, so you want a book that deals with preterism in a clear
yes,
way?
and so that the person that doesn't have a lot of Bible doctrine, doesn't know all these theological terms, that you can break it down to the ABCs so they can start to understand it, because most of them will never go to this level like we have here.
Right.
I think Wayne House and Randall Price have produced those chart books, which has clear, you can look at it and say, this is what this camp believes, this is what this camp believes, this is what this camp believes. And they do that with all of the different eschatological systems. What book is that, Randy? That chart book? Charts of Bible Prophecy is good. That's one I could think of. But what other books?
End Times Controversy by Tim LaHaye and Thomas Ice, editors. There are a lot of books like David Hawkins. Okay. You don't need a microphone.
You might want it on the tape so you can contradict it later. To answer the gentleman's question, if you'll go back to the table of Hope for Today, there's a little booklet called Replacement Theology. I know it's having an impact because we reprinted it numerous times, thousands of them, and that is being attacked severely by our preterist friends. That is what I wanted to say. I just want to thank Andy for that fantastic presentation. That was wonderful. Wonderful. There's a thread here that has been concerning me and also a few of my friends that are here who have Jewish roots. I think we should not be under any false assumptions here that a part of this problem, an enormous part of this problem, is the attitude about Israel. As a matter of fact, I have those copies, not to be distributed, but for my own benefit, of what took place on our debate speaker tonight on his radio program. And if you think this is just a discussion among Christian believers, you haven't got it yet. The attack, and we should know that from what we learn in our Bibles about Satan and his efforts, it's against Israel. And it's against the Jewish people. And it is so powerful. I was so disturbed, I didn't know what to do it. My wife just kept saying, David, just leave it alone. But yet at the same time, I'm really encouraged that we're going to have the debate here tonight. I don't know that we will achieve what we want to achieve. But please don't make any mistake in these excellent discussions. There's a root here, a root of bitterness, a root of rejection against the people of Israel. And if you want to really hear the truth, preterism now is big-time theology in Islam. Go to the websites of Islam and you will see. They love this truth about the preterism and the 70th week of Daniel being from 66 to 73 AD and the whole ball of wax. We also know the Roman Catholic Church loves this view. And you wonder how they could be bedfellows. But the common thing that ties them together is the hatred, the anti-Semitic attitudes towards the Jewish people. And we better remain alert to that because it's getting really tough. The entire Bush administration, every single member of it, are replacement theology people. Don't ever forget.
Go ahead.
Andy, a great job as usual. A bottom line question, so what? Can you give me one tangible benefit to be a partial preterist?
Benefit? Well, if you have I think what Dr. Hawking just said, if you have an underlying, let me kind of back up. One of the things, and I want to build on what Dr. Hawking said, as I've read Gentry's material, there's a resentfulness of the fact, not just that Israel is going to be returned to the land. There's a resentfulness of the fact of her millennial preeminence. See, the issue for us is not just a future for Israel. It's Israel is the future, not a future, the future. And that's the part of it they don't like. So if I don't like that idea, a theological system like this would be very tangibly helpful to me.
Yeah, it's the anti-futurist position.
Yeah.
So what? Because in a lot of areas, the rapture, there it goes. Israel flushed down the toilet twice, and all of those kinds of things. It's interesting. Who is that anti-Semitic group that? The Christian, they're fundamentalist, up in like Christian identity movement switched to preterism 15 years ago when it came out. They said, "Hey, this is great." 3 of the 4 Catholic books against the Left Behind used preterism to attack the Left Behind series and stuff like that. So it's seen as an answer. In certain academic, and seems to resonate with certain lay people.
Hi, Andy. That was a great presentation. One thing I just wanted you to comment on was Hank does make a connection to Ezekiel 16, and I think it's interesting. He makes that connection because in Ezekiel 16, it says to Jerusalem, "You are your mother's daughter," and it talks about where Jerusalem got her harlotry. And could you comment on how that corresponds to Revelation 17, where it calls the harlot the mother of harlotry?
That's a great point. This is why one of the reasons I believe Babylon means Babylon in Revelation 17 and 18, because she's the mother harlot. And to me, there's only one place in the Bible that describes that. To me, the mother is the source of all harlotry. And that only describes the Tower of Babel. Because what happened at the Tower of Babel? All the nations were together. There was one language. And so what happened at Babel affected every single language, every single culture that's ever followed. That's why I think Walbert in his commentary traces that mother-daughter cult, is it? From Babel all the way into these other regions, Syria, and so forth. So Tony's point is well taken, that Jerusalem doesn't fit that description because Jerusalem is not the source of all harlotry. At best, she's, as Tony said, a daughter harlot, but she is not the mother of all harlots. And so that's an excellent point.
And when the Apostle John was taken from Ephesus to Rome to be barbecued in oil and then returned to the Isle of Patmos to write the book of the Revelation of Jesus Christ, how old was he? Or when was this done?
Well, you're going to want to come back to the debate tonight because we're going to be dealing with that. He was